In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects. So, not too long ago, the Supreme Court came down with a what do they call it? A
A
conclusion?
ruling? A ruling?
A ruling. There we go. A ruling. Thank you.
Do your
A ruling.
research, brother.
They had some things to say, and they did it in a formal way. They ruled against Harvard and UNC with regard to using race in their admissions process. And so that's going to be the basis of the conversation. But I know that you wanted to spend a little bit of time laying the framework or the foundation for this topic. So you wanna run with that?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a couple of issues that we should discuss. One, the constitutionality of affirmative action in general, and then the effectiveness, of the policy. So, we talk about constitutionality. There's supposed to be no discrimination according to race by the federal government. So it's odd to me that we talk about the fact that we should have affirmative action. I wonder what your thoughts are on how that could coincide with the fact that the Constitution tells us that we shouldn't be judging people according to race, gender, those types of things.
Well, in before that ruling, there have been other rulings in the past that have noted that there are discrepancies with respect to race that you would expect in general in many situations uh, that certain populations, narrow populations, would to a degree reflect the overall general population, and that the Supreme Court will sometimes step in and intervene, or also Congress will as well, when they feel like that there are failings in that regard. And as an example, the Voting Rights Act required that the certain states check in with check in with the Department of Justice to try and limit the discrimination against minority races in those states. So there are certain circumstances where that will occur, and the affirmative action within admissions has been historically for the last 50 years, 60 years, has been one of those circumstances where it was deemed acceptable to favor a race that was historically underrepresented.
So is your contention then that if in a particular instance, um, the number of people from, and it's a difficult thing for me to say race when we're talking about just the color of people's skin, because we're all the human race, but a certain group of people, we can say race, I guess, because that seems to be the what people use, but a certain group of people underrepresented, and you would say if they're underrepresented, for example, they don't match the makeup of the population in general, then we should fix that, is what you're saying.
Well, there's so the looking broadly. So, if you were to say the university population, student population in general, if there are across, all or most of the universities, if there's a shortcoming, if they're not living up to the matching the general population, then chances are that there are some issues as to why. And so we don't need to get it to match exactly. And there may be particular institutions that don't match for various reasons. But if it's looks more universal is not the right word, but if you look at the entire university system, if it doesn't align, then it is something that should be addressed if it can be.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly disagree with that because I think assuming that the whole population is going to participate equally, or that different groups of disparate people with different cultures are going to participate equally in different activities, it's never the case. The most obvious example that people give all the time is let's look at the NBA or the NFL. Are we going to say, well, geez, we don't have enough white people or enough Asians or enough Indians in the NBA? because it should match the number, it should match the population as a whole. No, I don't think anybody makes that argument.
Well,
If
take a look
we,
at the NBA back in the 1960s, or the college population back in the 1960s, and we lived in a very different world where segregation and separation by race was a very common practice.
now, I would say, first off, the equal protection that is promised in the Constitution is for the federal government. And so for the federal government to go in, well, for the government in general, I guess, is probably some mirroring or matching of that with state governments. But I think we should distinguish between what the federal government is required to do and say, should every business have to do that? But more to your point, yeah, there was segregation back then. And now it's opened up. Like, I don't think that answers the question. Are you saying now because the percent of Black people in the NBA is much higher than the percent of Black people in the population as a whole, there's some sort of segregation, or there's some sort of improper hiring of NBA basketball players?
Well, no, because
But that's the argument you made earlier. You said earlier, well, listen, if it doesn't match the general population as a whole, then that must mean there's something wrong. So if that's the
no,
case, make that point with the NBA.
I did qualify by saying in general, and you know, that there are certain circumstances where it's going to be different. The NBA or any athletic organization has a very narrow criteria by which they bring on new personnel. Now, within the universities, there are
Just define the difference. They have a certain set of criteria, which is athleticism and ability to score and things like that.
sure.
The same as, but why would that be any different the way that universities look at it? They look at test scores and everything else.
Great question, and I'm glad you brought that question up, because that's what we're going to get into here.
No, don't change the subject. Tell me why the NBA is different.
Because the university is not just interested in your academic scores.
Okay. What
So,
else are they interested in?
what's that?
What else are they interested in?
Well, for example, a particular university might want to focus on their football team. Might want to recruit for their particular team. They might decide that their drama department needs a little bit of a push and a little bit of lift. They feel like that their drama department is something that a lot of people are going to be drawn to. And then there are some universities that are looking for.
What does that have to do? That doesn't prove anything. That doesn't have. What does that have to do with anything?
Well, if you are trying to encourage football players to come to your school, you might be willing to have a football player fill out the freshman class whose academics don't quite meet some of the more stringent criteria that you'd otherwise apply. You give
Are you
that.
saying that somehow makes the university less diverse or something? Like,
No.
I don't know what that has to do with. You're saying it's going to match the general population.
No, what I'm saying is that the university is not just looking at test scores. The university has a broader criteria by which they bring people in, by which they enroll students. Whereas a sporting team only looks at your athletic performance on that particular field. Now, I mean, they may also look at like team play, you know, sportsmanship and being a team player, but it's primarily around the ability to improve the team's performance.
I don't think you're making your point. Your point is that if you look at the population as a whole, the percentage of groups in the population as a whole should match what's in the university. Well, when people come into the university, the people trying to get there on athletics, by your argument, which is the population as a whole, it's going to match. Well, whether it's they're trying to get there because of athletic ability or academic ability or anything else, it should match. You're saying it would match. No. I'm saying it wouldn't. I'm saying that different people are, or different groups of people are drawn to different things. Different groups of people are drawn to athletics. Different people are drawn to academics. But you're saying it's going to match as a whole. But you say, well, because the university is very broad, then it should match as a whole. But NBA won't. I just don't understand the distinction that you're making.
There are a few different arguments that are encapsulated in what is that we're discussing. That, first of all, how do you identify whether there is a discrepancy in the racial makeup of a group? And one way you can look at it, does it represent the overall population? Now, as I was saying, there are certain circumstances where you won't have the racial makeup reflect the population. For example, a sporting team, because there's a different criteria. It's not just a representation of the general population. Now, the other aspect to that is that a university is not just looking to enroll students like an athletic team based on academic performance. They may be strictly interested in academic performance, but there's other reasons by which they would look at it. For example, in the 1978 case, that was sort of the benchmark of affirmative action. The one judge that was the deciding judge, Justice Powell, he said that the compelling state interest in a diverse student body in which everyone benefits from a range of perspectives in the classroom. And so in that situation, you are looking for a broad range of perspectives by race, by academics, by interests, by hobbies, by athletic activities, by all sorts of things. And the student population in general will benefit by that broad and diverse population.
But by your argument, that should happen naturally.
No.
Why not?
Why not? Because it can, but if a university is interested in that diverse population, then they'll go out and they'll focus and they'll pick. Because just as they may be interested in promoting the football team or the drama team or the chess club, they're going to look to ensure, because if they have, let's say in the previous year, they had a lot of people that came out for the drama club, and this year they want to really focus on our LARPing group, the live action role playing group that go out and pretend to be knights, and they feel like that part of their student body is waning a little bit, so they want to bring in some more of them. So they're going to weight this incoming class by that particular population.
Right, but you're not talking at all about race. You keep saying, well, they're going to look at different things, different interests that people have or different pursuits that people have. But your argument previously was if the university that the university should match the makeup of their student body should match what happens in the general population. So why would what you're saying, what they're doing, cause any problems with that? Wouldn't it just match the population like you're saying? Why doesn't it match the population?
Well,
and are you saying that it should? I don't even know what your argument is. You're kind of bringing up all these points, but are you saying, well, it won't match the general population if they go out and look for LARPing kids or student athletes or whatever else? Like, what is the issue? I'm saying there shouldn't be discrimination according to race. Affirmative action says there is, because you're talking about all these different ways that people look at things. And I'm saying, hey, when you look at it, you shouldn't say, I'm going to have one set of criteria for this group of people and another one for this other group of people. It should be the same. We should treat everybody the same.
Well, okay, so if let's go back and look at historically why affirmative action had to come into play, because it wasn't representing the population. And now the question is, how are we doing today?
So you're saying it would match the population. So we're back to where we started, which is you're saying it should match the population. And if it doesn't, there's a problem. And then I say, well, here's an example of where it doesn't match. Show me the problem. It's sports. Sports doesn't match the population. Why not? Are they racist?
Is who racist?
The people that are picking these sports teams.
No, they're not, because they're picking on one single criteria.
So you're saying if there's one criteria, we're talking about athleticism or their ability to play basketball, then they won't be racist. But if they have multiple criteria, then they will be racist?
Or no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that race doesn't play into it at all, because in sports, all they're looking at is that one aspect. And if it becomes heavily weighted by that particular race, it's not an issue to anybody because of the fact that they were only focused on that one criteria.
So you're saying if there were multiple criteria in the NBA and there were a lot of black people in the NBA, then it would be racist?
It depends on the criteria.
Like, what are the criteria?
Academics. Is that where you're going with this? I'm like, drama?
I don't know. I'm trying to figure out what you're saying. You're saying if there's more than one criteria, and there's a disproportionate representation in the results, then it must be racism. So I'm trying to figure out, why why that means racism. Just because there's more than one criteria. Like if you have one criteria and you end up with a disproportionately high group of people, well, that's not racism. But if you have multiple criteria and you end up with, for example, let's say you had one university that had a whole bunch of Asian people,
Hmm.
and there's multiple people, multiple criteria. Is that racist then? If a university ends up with a bunch of Asian people,
Well, it depends
even though they're
on
looking
how they ended up with that population. Were they
right, but
picking them because they
that's
were
not
Asian?
what you were saying before. You keep changing your argument.
No,
You first
listen,
you first
listen. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the racial makeup of a group can possibly indicate an issue, and so then you need to look at why that racial population is skewed one way or the other, or why it's fully distributed. It's not doesn't always mean that there's racism if you have a particular racial makeup, but it can, and then you need to look at why.
so make the so I still so fine. You're saying that I just don't understand. And then you kind of were explaining it by saying, well, if there's one criteria that they're looking at, then it's not racism. But if there are multiple, then it could be racism, I guess is what you're saying. So tell me how, if there's a university today that has a higher percentage of white people in the student body as compared to the general population, or more Asian people, or whatever, more black people, that's a problem for you. Tell me why that is.
I'm not. It's not a problem unless the reason why that population is what it is because they were chosen because of their race.
So affirmative action, but it's applied broadly, I guess. So how is it that we can determine, like you're saying, it's an individual university that we should be looking at and try to look at their recruiting techniques or something? But that's not the way that these court cases have gone. They said in general, we have to have the same number of, a higher number of, a certain race or something like that. But I just don't understand how that works. Like what you're saying is not how I've seen it played out. The way I've seen it played out is they say affirmative action, and then the university says, okay, we're going to get a certain number. We need a higher percentage of these people, so we're going to change the criteria for accepting this group of people, but not for this other group of people.
Hmm.
So I don't understand. I don't understand why that's the case. Like you're saying, well, we need to look at that carefully, but they don't look at it carefully. They apply it broadly.
Who doesn't look at it carefully? The university or those overseeing the university?
The federal government, they implement affirmative action and say, hey, you can, in my mind, go against the Constitution, which says don't discriminate according to race, color, creed, whatever. Don't discriminate. And then they force these universities to say, okay, you need to discriminate because I want you to have a higher number of this group of people and not that other group of people.
Well, remember that there are times where the federal government and the Supreme Court has said that there are times where it is acceptable to discriminate when there is a group that is being put down, that is being held back by some group, some organization. So, for example, with the Voting Rights Act, or with when affirmative action came out, and affirmative action that was supported by the Supreme Court many times, including the big case of 1978, because the big case of 1978 was very similar to the case that came out now, where there was an individual that said he should have gotten into, I think it was Cal Poly. It was a school in California, but because he was white, he didn't get in. And at that time, the school had a quota of I think it was Asian students that they were looking to bring into their school. And he said that's one of those spots should have been his. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court came down with a ruling that said that it is, I'll read it to you.
Mhm.
As I said before, the compelling state interest in a diverse student body in which everyone benefits from a range of perspectives in the classroom. So there are certain circumstances where the Supreme Court said that you can choose one race over another.
And cases and instances where they didn't as well. But we're discussing how they should rule. I guess the problem I'm trying to get at with you, Brian, I don't quite understand. It's these nebulous ideas that you're presenting of like, well, if there's a problem, then they can address it. And if there is racism, they can address it. But we need to talk in specifics about, okay, well, what is the problem? For example, if you have a university, I guess, well, at the risk of being a little bit racist myself, we should talk a little bit about why there could be differences that have nothing to do with race. Now, I think both of us, as we went to high school, there were a lot of Asian students that scored very high on the SAT and had got very good grades. Does that mean that they were somehow treated unfairly? They were given advantages that we weren't, or were they just interested in academics, and were their parents very interested in academics? I mean, different groups of people seek after different things, and I think the problem that I have with affirmative action is it is so common for people to say, well, I see a different outcome than what is reflected in the general population. That's racism. And I think that's what people who are against affirmative action are afraid of is it's a very easy thing to say, well, there are fewer black people in this university than is represented in the general population, or there's too many Asian people or whatever else. So we need to fix that. And there could be a lot of different reasons why there are fewer or more people in the university that have nothing to do with discrimination by race. And we
Okay,
should have
so
the same criteria.
if we go back to the 1960s, you feel like that affirmative action should not have been implemented.
Yeah, I do.
You
I think
feel
it's
like the segregation that was happening in the South, not just in the South, but in other, in the North as well, and the
no,
fact that there.
I think you're conflating a couple of issues because you talked about the Voting Rights Act before, which I don't consider affirmative action. The Voting Rights Act says everybody gets a right to vote. Yeah, got no problem with that.
And the
And when the
reason why it
Fed,
came into play was because there were certain states that were restricting certain racial populations from the same voting rights that other populations had.
exactly, but that's not affirmative action. That's the Voting Rights Act. Those are two different things. Affirmative
Well,
action is saying, listen, if you're going to be bringing a bunch of students into the university, you have quotas. You have to bring a certain number of each group of people into the university, and I don't think that works. I do agree the federal government should never discriminate. Anybody that has public funding, we should never discriminate. But affirmative action, I don't think is a good policy. I don't think it brings the desired results, and I think oftentimes it's applied incorrectly because, for example, we don't want affirmative action with the NBA. There happen to be a lot of black people that are either just better at basketball or are much more interested in pursuing that career.
okay, but if we go back to the world back in the 60s, and you're saying that public universities that are receiving public funding should never discriminate, it would have been okay for private universities to discriminate against people of different races.
Unfortunately, and even businesses.
And
Yeah,
that's nothing the government should do about that. Just say that that's how it goes.
that's how it goes.
Well, I mean, another thing that one can look at is if you look at the population of the enrollment over the last 40 years, I think it was, you can see a very strong increase in the population, the enrollment of black students. They went up by 3%. This what is this time frame? 76 to 2008. So basically 30 years. Hispanic students increased by 9%. Asian and Pacific Islander increased by 5%. The white population decreased by 20%.
Yeah,
So,
Brian, I think this is the type of thing that I'm talking about. You say, hey, we had affirmative action, and then you find some other statistic that is, okay, black enrollment in universities has gone up. That's the reason because of
that's not what
affirmative
I said.
action. No,
But
but you're implying it by saying like, hey, well, this is what happened, Colin. I mean, we're talking about it sounds like to me that you're implying that that was the reason that enrollment went up. And I think there are a lot of reasons that enrollment increased. And I think it's great. But I
such
don't
as
think such as what? What do you
what are some of the reasons that black enrollment went up at the universities over the 30 years from 76 to 2008?
I'm sure there's a lot of different reasons. People getting more opportunities, the economy is increasing, more people are going to university in general. Uh, you know, yeah, I don't know. They're more interested in those types of things. I'm not a sociologist, but I think in all aspects that is improving. To say that we're going to ascribe it to just affirmative action, I mean, I was reading in that article that I sent you that college enrollment was increasing before the Civil Rights Act in 1964.
Sure, but of course, what I was referencing was actually percentages of the population, not just broad increases.
Percentages were increasing before 1964, the Civil Rights Act and affirmative action.
Right, and the college populations were increasing, in particular of those races, because the white population was decreasing over that same time frame that I was referencing.
Well, I mean, and to say that it's a zero-sum game, why not like more universities could open up? Like, do you want white enrollment to be reduced as a percentage of the population so that other groups of people can increase? I would just
Well,
hope that we can all go, you know? I don't
for
think we need
sure.
to be picking and choosing.
Well, and universities did increase enrollment because the number of white students going to universities increased, but the percentage representation decreased because there was a greater increase in some of the other races that were going to schools.
But once again, I would hope that that greater increase could be taken up by more universities, more opportunities, as opposed to saying it has to be a zero-sum game, or at least that we have to reduce the percentage of white enrollment to increase black enrollment or anything else. The only problem I have, Brian, is the criteria. It should be colorblind. The criteria should be the same for everybody. In another problem that people have with this is if you, for example, say, well, there's a reason that it's very difficult to get into Harvard. I mean, part of the reason is because if it weren't so difficult, I mean, the people that can't get in probably wouldn't survive there. So when we lower the standards for a certain group of people, then it's going to be harder for those students once they get there. And, to say that Harvard is the only place you could go, there's certainly an argument to be made that somebody who is not quite up to Harvard standards, or maybe the lower third of Harvard standards, gets in if they would have gone to a different university, say BYU, where I went, because it's not as prestigious as Harvard or Syracuse or whatever else, they might do better there. Instead of being at the bottom of the class, they could be at the top of it. But for example, if I think I just don't understand how lowering the standards, especially in an academic situation, we think that's going to be a good idea and somehow help these people. When, for example, if I got let into Harvard, how would it have been for me? It would have been very, very difficult. I was not a diligent student. Maybe I'm just not as smart as those guys. And so for me to get in there would it not necessarily have been a good thing for me.
Well, and that's one of the arguments that is brought up frequently by people, that when you lower the standards too far, you make it difficult for those that are admitted to succeed. That there still must be some standards, because unless the university is academically freedom, or academically free, is academically loose, doesn't have the academic rigor, that the individuals that are let into the schools still have to be able to perform academically. So you can't lower the standards too far. At the same time, there are other criteria than strictly academic performance. And one of the arguments I heard put forth against affirmative action is that race alone wasn't, in this day and age, a really valuable distinction. And they gave the example of a white upper class individual from Westchester County, New York, that went to all the right prep schools and vacation in the right places, is not going to be that different from an upper class black person that grew up in Westchester County, that went all the right private schools and basically had the same life. And they're saying at this point, at this day and age, if you really want to get a diverse population, instead of looking at race, look at things like regions that they grow up in. Maybe look at zip codes. Look at the different cities that they grow up in. You're much more likely to get a diverse population than race alone. And I think it's a valid point.
Well, yeah, I would agree. And I think affirmative action has the tendency to help a certain group of people. We sometimes want to always split us up according to race, but we should be looking more closely at economic opportunities, those types of things, because a poor white person or a poor black person is more, they may have a life that's been much more similar than to a rich white person or a rich black person or a rich Asian or something like that.
And I do think there's a value to having a diverse population. I think that instead of reading about life in Southern Appalachia, to actually meet someone and hear about their life experience, I think it sits with us a little bit more effectively, and we get a better understanding of what that life is like. And so having that exposure, I think, is really important. And I also do want to point out that in this the Supreme Court case that just happened, where the majority of the court ruled against Harvard and UNC, one of the dissenting opinions, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, within her opinion, she said, quote, "The majority's vision of race neutrality will entrench racial segregation in higher education because racial inequality will persist as long as it is ignored." And that made me sad, because she is saying that we as a society cannot avoid racism. And I feel like that we are moving in the right direction. Maybe we haven't gotten to the place that she wants to be, but she is arguing that we need the government, we need the man to come out and tell us how to avoid racism, because we as a people can't do it. I do feel like the affirmative action guidelines were a very broad and blunt instrument that were very necessary back in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. And as time has gone on, they're not as useful. And now we need to, instead of coming at the problem with an axe, we need to come at it with a scalpel and be a little more particular about how we work on solving the problems.
Yeah, Brian, that argument that she makes and that you echo is exactly the point I was trying to contradict before. She comes at that with no evidence. She says, well, I guess the only evidence she has is the results aren't like I would like them to be, or I would expect them to be. Instead of saying, because it's very difficult to say why we get those results. If there is a higher number of Asian people in these universities than is represented in the population, well, what advantage did they benefit from? Because it wasn't the same, as some other racial groups, blacks specifically, but there was a lot of discrimination against Asians for a long time. So how somehow have they, in spite of all of that, why are they represented in higher degrees at more prestigious universities than white people? Why is that happening? She says, well, it doesn't look like I want it to be, but what she's talking about specifically is certain groups of people, not all of them. And there may be other reasons. Like, is it racism that more Asians are accepted into these universities? Okay, if we're going to say no, then why is it racism if Hispanics or Black people are not accepted at higher rates at these universities?
Yeah, and then we come up with this new racial category of white adjacent. The Asian is called white adjacent. I'm not even sure what that even means. I think that it's the way of saying that we're not going to include them as a people of color because they don't fit our standards and the norms that we have. I don't know.
No, it's because it doesn't fit the narrative. Because if you say, well, listen, I have these groups of people that are underrepresented in the universities, that proves my racism. And then somebody comes back and says, well, what about this other group that is overrepresented? And it doesn't fit the narrative. Okay, well, that's white adjacent. Well, I don't even know what that means. I feel like it's just because when Justice Sotomayor says that, there's no proof to say that the underrepresentation of certain races in certain places is the result of discrimination and racism. It's very, very difficult to prove that because there are so many factors that go into what make up a people. They have different interests. They focus on different things. You can think of, in that article that I sent you by Thomas Sowell, you can see so many examples of overrepresentation in certain fields of a certain group of people, and it's got nothing to do with racism. Many times it's a group of people that doesn't have political power. So, and one example is the NBA, but there's a lot of different examples. Diamond merchants in New York City. Why are so many of them Jewish? Does that mean there's racism that Jewish people are overrepresented there, or Indian people that start convenience stores? They seem to do that in droves. I don't know why. Does that mean that it's racist that 7-Eleven or these other convenience store providers are racist, that they only like certain groups of people? No. They just seem to migrate to those areas, and we cannot prove that is racism. And I think her blanket statement and you agreeing with it and saying, well, yeah,
I didn't agree with her. I was opposed to what she said. I was anti what she said.
Oh, you said I was sad. I thought you were saying I was sad, meaning that she's right, that we're going to have this racist problem. Okay.
No. Not at
No,
all.
thank you for
I
clarifying
found it
that.
very upsetting that she was basically saying that we will devolve into the racist South that existed for 100 years unless the government comes in with the big stick and beats us away from that eventual state.
Correct. I think one of the greatest things that one of the, I mean, the point that I'm trying to make is if we sit back a little bit, for example, if there's a certain group of people that is really qualified and really wants to get into these universities, and these universities are rejecting them, they'll end up someplace else, and those universities will do better because of it. For example, if we tried to start a competitor to the NBA, and we said we're only going to hire American Indians or Asians or white people or something like that, it would not the quality of play would not be as good because we should be looking only at the ability of those people that we're hiring. And the same should be true when you're recruiting students, when you're recruiting anybody for anything. Racism will go away eventually if we stand back and let it. But affirmative action, it's almost like affirmative action says we need to combat racism with more racism.
So what you're saying is if we had left the South alone back in the 60s, the segregation would have gone away. They would have desegregated on their own. All those
Now, once again, you're conflating issues. When we talk about the governments, they cannot discriminate. When we talk about the Voting Rights Act, we cannot discriminate.
But it wasn't just the governments that were discriminating.
Correct. What I'm saying is we don't need to worry about all the businesses eventually. Like if you have a town where black people are, there's no restaurants for them, then other restaurants that begin serving them are going to do much better. I think that stuff, it was going to happen, but there was so much government that what was causing the problem there was government. The Voting Rights Act, for example, all this segregation was from the police. The state was enforcing segregation. Why would you fight against it if you're a white person? Because even the government is against you for it. So if you take the government out of it, I think it eventually does go away.
That's
Because
a lot
I'm
of
like
wishful
you.
thinking on your part. I'd love to see an example of where that actually happened because I can't think of that actually happening.
Well, did the NBA start hiring more black people because of affirmative action, or because they were trying to get a higher quality of players?
I don't know. You have to go and do some research on that and give me the answer.
It was not because of affirmative action. The government has not enforced hiring requirements on the NBA or the NFL or MLS and any of those different. So there's an example of where we went the opposite direction in spite of this supposed racism that would never go away that you were talking about. The Boston Celtics, I mean, Boston was a very, very racist city, and they began to hire a lot of black athletes. There's your example is sports. We went the opposite direction, and it wasn't from enforcement from the government.
Well, we'll have to call it there because we're out of time. So you got the last word, and
We got a minute and 11 seconds, it looks like.
I could try and rush something in, but you're going to want to respond. I
You
don't
can
feel like
do
there's
the
a whole
last
lot
if
we
you'd
can work
like.
with. A minute 11 seconds isn't a lot to work with. So
Okay.
we'll call this done.
All right, Brian.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.
We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.